everybody. Welcome to Whitelock Fever Live. And this came up quite spontaneously through, believe it or not, LinkedIn. I just happened to be involved in the conversation with this guy, and turns out that he's living in New Zealand and he's got a new business, and he used to be the CEO of the NRL and many other things. Welcome to the program, David Moffett.
Dave from Hornsby, isn't it, mate?
Dave from Hornsby. Dave from Hornsby. We'll discuss that. There's so much to talk about. I mean, I don't know where to begin, but I guess we might start with your most recent endeavour and work backwards, and that's something called rugby rules. What is rugby rules?
So it's a variation of rugby union, but it's a much simpler game to understand. It's safer to play. I'm very critical of the way rugby's going. On the other hand, I've got a lot of good things to say about the way rugby league's going. And to get things changed in rugby union is almost impossible, really. I mean, you've World Rugby and the national governing bodies are glacial in what they should be doing, and unlike rugby league. So my first love was always rugby, but I'm like so many other people are so disappointed with the direction it's going that I thought, well, I'll try and do something about it.
So is it the lack of adaptability to short form versions? I mean, sevens is massive, right? But you don't see sevens as sort of a participant thing, but more a spectator thing. So is that the area where you're most critical?
No, I think sevens is a short form of the game, and it's an Olympic sport now, and there are so many other countries that play it. It is a completely different game. Unlike nines in rugby league, which is pretty much still the same, but with fewer players on the field. Sevens is a completely different game, but one of the issues is that, I mean, if you took Kenya, for example, which is where I was brought up, and if they've beaten the New Zealand sevens teams quite frequently, but if you put them up against the All Blacks, it means to be 150 points because of the way in which the game is played at 15s. And so, what I've tried to set out to do is to write a set of rules which simplifies the game for everybody. Coach, player, referee, but most importantly, spectators. I mean, even now, if you've grown up with rugby, you're flat out understanding what the hell's going on. And it cannot be good. I mean, I know you're a rugby league reporter. We've crossed swords a few times in the past, but I mean, and I got into trouble for calling. Phil Gould got stuck into me for calling rugby league 5-tackle kick before I got there. Well, I was defending rugby, obviously, but it's a game that's easy to understand, and it's easier to referee. And rugby's gone the opposite direction.
Yeah. How much resistance have you had from the rugby union authorities, or have you to what you're proposing?
I think they're just trying to ignore us and hope that we'll go away, but we're not going to do that. We see one of the big issues with rugby is it's become quite a dangerous sport, and they talk about how brutal rugby is, but, it's not brutal in the same sense that rugby league is. Rugby league is man on man, right? In rugby now, they have all these players being taken out on the fringes of rucks and mauls, injured badly. Brodie Retallick, great All Black, knocked out of the game for 3 months with shoulder injury. And was never anywhere near as good in the World Cup. The issue is, it's not so much what's going to happen, happening to those players now. It's how they're going to be in 20 years' time. And as we're seeing in American sport, there's a lot of litigation going on because they didn't deal with things like head injuries. I mean, in rugby's now got an unacceptable number of concussions. I know they're trying to address it, but unless they change the laws, it's going to be difficult.
Yeah. So, okay, this first question's led into several others. What are your plans with rugby rules? What are you trying What are you doing to sort of activate it worldwide? What does it mean in the real world? Your endeavour?
Okay, in the real world, we've done the easy bit. Writing the 10 rules and 6 regulations has been simple, really, by comparison with the next steps. We've got to get the game being played, and we're working on that at the moment. We've only launched it a week ago, so there's. But we're doing that. We'll get the game played, and then we'll have some footage of it, and people will be able to see how it's played. I mean, it's a game that can be played from people from 8 to 80. And when I say 80, people say, "What are you talking about?" Well, we got golden oldies, rugby, and that game is quite difficult for older people. But this game will be a lot easier for them to play. Yeah. So, what we need to do, Steve, now though, is to get some footage of the game being played, and we're working on that in places in America, the UK, Argentina, New Zealand, and hopefully in Australia.
Right. And as you'd be more aware than anyone else, having run governing bodies, when you put together new versions of sport, there are all sorts of things that you can't avail yourself of, like insurance, government funding, match officials, disciplinary. So you've got to set up all these systems yourself. That's got to be, you need deep pockets to do those sorts of things, don't you,
Yeah, you do. But you also need a whole lot of people that are really interested in what you're doing. And we're already seeing that. We've got a lot of people that are going to be working as advocates and ambassadors and people that are going to be, just talking about the benefits of this game. And yeah, you do need deep pockets, and we're about to go down the cash raising road of crowdfunding. So we'll see. I mean, we think it's worth doing. So let's give it a crack.
Do you start by having a big launch game that everyone watches, or do you start by setting up a competition for participants, or do you start? What's the big?
Okay, game? I think the way to start this is most likely within the school system, within the juniors in the club system, because you can get hold of players there that haven't actually learnt all the wrong things, as far as we're concerned, and then build it from there. I mean, ideally, we've given ourselves some 6-month targets, 12-month targets, 2-year targets, and we'll see how we progress. I mean, there's most likely a lot of cynicism out there why we're doing it and all this sort of stuff. I mean, I read, I don't know if you've seen this guy who's got this hybrid game of league
Franks
rugby. Yeah. I mean, I'd heard about it, but I hadn't seen it. I mean, the idea that you can play when you're in one half of the field, you play one game, and in the other half of the field you play the other is just bullshit. That's never going to get off the ground, and I don't think that would be of interest to rugby league fans, and I don't think it'd be interest to rugby fans.
Yeah.
However, having said that, I think when people have a look at this game and the way it's played, you could most likely attract some rugby league players to play it because it's not as complicated to play. Okay, so you still have lineouts, but there's no lifting in lineouts or anything like that. You've got to be an athlete. You've got to be able to jump. I mean, and there are some bigger players now playing rugby league. And I think, it's not trying to be a hybrid game or bring the games together because they've got so much tradition and history. And besides that, I think rugby league's going really well. I mean, they just suffer from the fact that they find it difficult to get beyond the north of England and the eastern seaboard of Australia and New Zealand. That's always been their issue.
Yeah, David. We'll move on to, you mentioned rugby league. Good segue. How, with the benefit of hindsight, how do you look back on your time at the NRL? That's a big. That's a question you could probably I could just shut up and you could talk for a couple of hours, so I'll be more specific. also how it ended. How did it really end, as opposed to how it ended in a public-facing way? I guess is a way to focus the question a little bit more. What are your recollections?
Very interesting. I copped a lot of flack, and certainly about what happened with Souths, and it was quite interesting because I inherited that. But I'm not the sort of person to say, well, that's got nothing to do with me. That was the people before me. I just dealt with it, and the way it panned out, in actual fact, started getting me thinking. And I'll answer that last bit of that question in a minute, and you'll see why I started thinking the way I started to think. And I tried to bring about some change. Tried to get everybody together to have a common approach to things, and that didn't work. We did some good broadcasting deals, but they pale into insignificance, against the one that they did prior to this Wu flu taking over the world. So I was only there for 2 years, and there were two things that happened, Steve.
Hello, David. Still there, David? Hello. Hello, everybody. So we had David Moffett on, and he was about to say something really interesting. And as is often the case with technology and doing these sort of video casts, just when someone's about to say something interesting, the line drops out. So we'll see if we can get him back.
I guess.
Yeah. Hello, David. David? Hello. David.
G'day, mate.
Yeah, you dropped out. So you said two things happened. A couple of things happened, and you dropped out after that. Can you pick up what you were saying there?
Yeah, sure. I was going to say there are three things that happened.
Yeah, there's still some sort of, I don't know if you're all reading me or whether the poor reception is at my end. But once more, David's frozen. So this is obviously very interesting for me from my book point of view, because doing a book on the 1997 season and the expulsion of South Sydney a couple of years later was one of the things that probably that period is best remembered for. I spoke to Neil Whittaker for the book. He hasn't done a regular interview. Hello, David.
The first was that.
Yep. Sorry, mate. I was just padding because you dropped out, but I'll be quiet.
Yeah.
Can you hear me now?
I can, and I've turned my camera off in case that makes it a bit better, if that's all right.
Yeah, it appears to be much better. So, yeah, you said there were three things that happened, and I'll just shut up now and let you talk.
Okay. Rightio, mate. The first, it says here that your network bandwidth is low, so I don't know. Anyway, we'll keep talking.
Yep.
Mate, the first was the way that I found out about News Limited doing a deal with South Sydney. They didn't involve me in that, and I was the chief executive. And in actual fact, David Gallop found out before I did, and I didn't think that was very good form, to be perfectly honest with you. The next thing was that I suppose with that in the back of my mind, I woke up one day and I said, if I had my druthers, would I work for News Limited? And the answer to that was no, because I found it really quite difficult to understand how come the journalists would hammer the hell out of the NRL, and yet they owned 50% of it. I'm talking about News Limited journalists. I mean, I understand why. I mean, I understand the personalities. I understood the reasoning behind it. But it most likely made the job a little bit more difficult. I mean, you know what I'm like, mate. I accept the brickbats, and if you want to have a crack at me, go right ahead. But you know, I was a little bit sort of perturbed by that sort of behaviour. And then at the same time, I was approached by Sport England to go and do the job there. So all those three things all came together, and I decided that that's what I prefer to do. You know, this is not a huge criticism of News Limited. You know, they'd brought in, they were looking at, you know, getting a whole lot of product, but I just think that, you know, it was just not the right way to go about dealing with the chief executive.
Yeah, and the deal with Souths you're talking about was to basically try to, you know, keep, I guess, I mean, the deal you're referring to, how would you describe what that deal was? Because obviously Souths ended up out of the comp, you know, so.
No, but they came back in.
Yeah.
What I'm talking about was the period of time when following all of those, you know, marches and all of the negative publicity, they you know, I was out there saying, look, they've made a decision. The decision's been made, and Souths are out of the competition. Unbeknownst to myself, there was discussions going on about actually doing a complete backflip on that. And that's fine. You know, I mean, they're the owners, but all they needed to do was keep me informed. So, you know, I mean, that's life. That's what happened. They're really tough people running News Limited. You know, so I don't hold any grudges against them. I just made decisions.
Yeah. What your time in rugby league? You know, you talked earlier about its inability to spread. Can you identify cultural reasons for that? And like, obviously, as an outsider, that meant you had to try that much harder to prove yourself. There was all that stuff. I mean, for the viewers and listeners, Dave from Hornsby, Dave used to ring up Breakfast Sports Radio in Sydney and just introduce himself as Dave from Hornsby and not say he was the CEO of the NRL. There was a drama about the Tour de France, and you went on the footy show with your bike. You know, how would you sort of sum up those sort of cultural quirks of the game in Australia, particularly, and maybe extrapolate how those things impact on the game's progress now and since?
Look, rugby league is a fascinating and a great sport. And you would know, as having covered so much of it for so long, that without the drama, it wouldn't be the same game. You know, the fact that you can wake up every morning, not know what the hell is going to come through the door, whether it's Hopawati, the issues surrounding that, whether it's, I think you were in the press room at, I'll blame you, at Parramatta Stadium when I said I was hoping to go to France, to the Tour de France, and with my son, and the next day it's all over the paper. How can Moffett go to the Tour de France in the middle of a football season? It was interesting because Malcolm Node was the chairman, I think, at the time of the NRL. And when he left and then he went to the Bulldogs, I think he did the same thing. He left and went on holidays in the middle of the football season. I mean, I always had the view that, you know, for 2 weeks, I didn't actually need to be there. We had some good people, but in the end, I didn't go. And I did do an advertisement for the Tour de France for Fox when I was on my bike, and there was a script, but I threw the script out of the window a bit because I said, well, my name is David Moffett. I was going to go to the Tour de France, but unfortunately I was not able to make it. So I had a bit of fun with that. I used to enjoy my time with the media. I had a bit of fun with the guys, and you know, a guy like Rothfield would climb into me and you know, those sorts of things. But yeah, I don't think if you didn't take it too seriously, you could survive it.
Yeah. And because I'm doing a book, I'm on 1997, and as I was padding when you dropped out and talking to whoever's listening or watching, but I just the South thing is obviously a hangover and a result of the Super League war. I just wonder how many, when you arrived there, how much hangover from the Super League war there still was. Obviously, there were criteria that had been imposed, which you've already mentioned. Was it still a deeply divided, game when you took over?
Yeah. Yes, it was. And there wasn't the healing, I think, that's now taken place. You still had some very strong personalities, the Phil Goulds and those guys who, had their entrenched positions. And I mean, over time, I think it's got a lot better, and those days are part of the history of rugby league.
Mm-hmm.
But a lot of people said about my background in rugby. I never played rugby league, but I was always a big fan of rugby league. I said at the time, my son was named after Changa.
Yeah.
Graham Latin, for example, because I thought, and there were so many phenomenal players back in that era that I used to love watching. So, I had an understanding of rugby league. And I used to go out and stand on the hill with the fans and talk to them and trying to get to understand what was going on. But then you had the problem with the Bulldog supporters, and I would go and stand on the hill with them at that time and talk to them. But ultimately, a sport like rugby league is much, much bigger than one person.
Yeah.
And it's all of the drama that surrounds rugby league that people love. Rugby league people need the drama. They need to see this stuff. And of course, a lot of it's not very savoury, as we know. You've written about it, but it doesn't seem to matter to the people that follow it, mate. They just what are the back 12 pages of the telly? A rugby league, I mean, it's but one thing that I am very, very proud of, and Shuey was the guy that helped this, was we actually put some teeth into the salary cap when I was there. We absolutely said, if we're going to have a salary cap, then we're going to have to police it. And so that was one of the things that I was quite pleased about, and then it carried on, and I think it's still got some teeth today.
Well, a couple of premierships got stripped, didn't they? I just got two more questions before we go, Dave. We might have a chat afterwards after we finish the show. One is your involvement in Sanzar and all that sort of thing. So what impact was the Super League war on rugby union turning professional or openly professional? Like, you were around in rugby union during the start of the Super League war, and obviously a lot of rugby union players initially got picked off. There's some funny stories in the book about those years. How profoundly did the Super League war impact on rugby union's sort of trajectory towards open professionalism?
It was the single biggest factor.
Wow.
in the Southern Hemisphere. It was huge. And I was right in the middle of it. I mean, we were very worried that Super League, because they basically had two competitions, were going to need players. And where were they going to get them from? I mean, they were going to get them from rugby. So, you remember a guy called Ian Frickberg, larger than life character who sadly is no longer with us. We contacted News Limited, and they said that the only two people that can pull off a deal for rugby would be Ian Frickberg and Sam Chisholm. And so I rang Frickberg. He happened to be in Tokyo at the time, and I said, being told to have a chat to you. I can't remember the name. It was David somebody, another from News Limited, and he said, you got to speak to Frickberg. So I did. And then very shortly thereafter, there was a meeting set up with Sam Chisholm in London. And, larger than life, I mean, a very small man, but geez, his presence was huge. So I flew to London at the request of the Australian Rugby Union, because they were just all on their way to South Africa for the World Cup. And I got back to Australia 8 weeks later. because I was shuttling in between, London and South Africa and back while we put this deal together. And there were basically 5 people that did that on our side, and the main mover was Frickberg. Then there was the 3 chairmen, so that was Leo Williams from Australia, Richie Guy, and Louis Late. And then there was myself. I was doing all the administration stuff. So we managed to get the money, but we didn't have the players. And Ross Turnbull at the time, who set up World Rugby, or WRC, which I christened World Rugby Circus, was floating around the same hotel in Johannesburg. And I never spoke to him, but he knew what I was doing and I knew what he was doing. And of course, and that was with David Lord and Kerry Packer. I don't know if Kerry was ever really serious or whether he was just, the burr under the saddlecloth for Rupert.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, they ended up with the players, but no money.
Yeah.
So money was always going to win out.
Yeah.
And it was interesting, just prior to the World Cup final, we had a press conference and we announced that we'd done this $555 million US deal over 10 years. The rest of the people, the media in that room, it was bang. As soon as the media conference finished, they went and surrounded this guy who I didn't know at the time, but he wasn't the CEO, because I think he was, whatever they call him, the secretary of the Rugby Football Union, wanting to know from him what he thought about it all. Ireland came out the next day and said, we'll never be able to play them again because they're going to be professional. And within 3 months, the whole game went professional, because it was all over. It was absolutely all over. Whatever the Northern Hemisphere thought they were going to do about it, if they refused, then I think there was going to be a big split in the game. And but it was. I don't think so. It was all brought about by Super League, but it was accelerated by Super League.
Yeah,
there is no doubt that it might have taken 2 or 3 years longer to get the game to be professional, but it was absolutely accelerated by Super League.
And David, the last thing I want to ask you is you've said a lot of complimentary things about rugby league and some critical things about rugby union. But the fact is that rugby union is at the top table of world sport, for better or worse, and rugby league is not. What has to change in rugby league for it to break out of this sort of this paradigm, this feedback loop that's been stuck in since 1895? I mean, I know it's a huge question, but you've been on both sides of the fence and at very senior positions on both sides. Have you got any thoughts?
Yeah, mate. I don't understand why rugby league isn't able to make any ground around the world. I mean, for a start, you'd think America would be there with open arms. I guess what's happened is that rugby maintains a foothold in America because of sevens. They could win the gold medal at the Olympics, the American sevens team. 15-a-side is still seen as that college game, where it was all about having a few beers and rugger and all that sort of stuff, which rugby league never had that sort of an image. But, I mean, if you were going to take a game of rugby to America, it would surely have to be rugby league. Because why? One, it's easy to understand. When it's televised, it's all about what's happening around the ball. And yet it's never been able to take off. They've tried, and I know there's rugby league being played in little pockets around the world, but for some reason, and I don't know what. I mean, I've never studied it that closely. I just don't. Perhaps it's never had the sort of reputation of being an international sport. I mean, look at Aussie rules. Look how big that is in Australia, and it's only played in Australia. So, I mean, they've even look. I mean, take the Storm, hugely successful team in Melbourne, but they still haven't really cracked it, have they? In Melbourne, they still haven't cracked it as far as the Melburnians are concerned. They'll get 15,000 people and next door there'll be 100,000 people watching a club game.
Yep.
You know, so, and the idea that rugby should be trying to crack that market is absurd. You know, I just don't understand why they're doing it, but there you go. I mean, yeah, so I don't have the answers to that. If I did have, I most likely, could most likely concentrate on doing something like that.
Well, how about we turn off the recorders? I'll tell you what the answers are, and you can do it full time. Okay, I really appreciate your time, David. It's great to hear from you after all this time. One of the best things about doing this book is, I was talking to Greg McCallum before I spoke to you, and one of the best. I know we're not talking for the book, but just generally speaking, I'm a long way from home in London, and the book's given me a great opportunity to speak to people I haven't spoken to in a long time, and I'll throw this in with that. So thank you very, very much for your time, David. If you stay on the line, we'll have a chat.
Okay, mate.